All right, welcome. We're coming to you live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. This is the week ahead where we set the tone for you for the week ahead, of course, on the news front. As always, I am your host, Liezle Wilson. Let's take a look at your headlines. President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to address the nation tonight on developments of government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa's coronavirus positivity rate declines to 24.3% with 12,056 cases reported in the last 24 hours. On the sporting front, British and Irish Lions beat South Africa in the first test in Cape Town. Right now, as we take a look at the week ahead, our top story at this hour: schools across South Africa are set to reopen on Monday, the 26th of July. This is adjusted lockdown level 4 regulations expected to be announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa today. Now, the move to lockdown level 4 saw schools closing, impacting teaching time, all expected during the winter break. But to chat about the state of readiness for the reopening of schools, we're joined by General Secretary of SATU, Mogoena Maluleke. A very good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Maluleke. Let's look at the impact that the overall vaccine rollout plan has had on the sector. I mean, what has been the response? Has there been vaccine hesitancy? Walk us through that.
Good afternoon, Liezle, and good afternoon to your viewers at home, and thank you for this opportunity. As an organization, we want to appreciate the response by the teachers and the education workers who have responded to the vaccination. 89% of them have been vaccinated, and then only 11% have other reasons. For example, they might have been those who have been tested positive, and therefore they needed to wait for 40 days or 30 days, and they might those who have been hesitant, and we are working on that as the 5 unions, working very hard to ensure that we give them information, we give each other education, so we deal with this particular hesitation. But to defeat this particular virus and the pandemic, we must defeat fake news, we must defeat disinformation and misinformation, and that requires education to really build resilience and making sure we form and build champions and ambassadors.
Looking at schools and how they've typically responded to occupational health and safety matters at large, how have schools in the wake of this COVID-19 pandemic been compliant during these unprecedented times then?
Thank you for that question. It's important that we go back to 2020 when we didn't understand this particular pandemic, and indeed we were just running around setting up procedures that were, influenced by the Department of Culture. We did our best, and what we were able to do as the teaching fraternity and as education, one was to build resilience in our children, and in the education system, we have seen how the system became very resilient in terms of establishing, tracking and tracing, records, so that we're then able to avoid that. We're using the schools as the barriers against the transmission, because once we have educated our learners, we know they are ambassadors. They tell their parents to be able to wear their masks at all material time, to be able to wash their hands. We're going back basically to the basics of living healthy in terms of hygiene, and that is what we saw. Yes, there are problems there and there, but we were able as the teachers. I want to thank the teachers of this country and thank the parents and our learners who have done everything they could to build that particular resilience. And therefore, because of that particular wealth of experience and information, we're building on to improve on a daily basis.
So as we've heard from you then on the occupational health and safety measures that have been implemented, we can't ignore the operating standards of schools during these unprecedented times. I mean, practically, what has learning and development looked like? What approaches have been implemented with a sharp focus on matriculants?
Yeah, thank you for that. What the schools have done basically in terms of the standard operating procedures was to make sure that they are screening, and from the screening, the temperature were taken, and they keep that particular record so that they are able to satisfy the requirements by the WHO and the NICD that the schools must be able to have the record for tracking and tracing. And that's what happened. They were cleaning in terms of the surfaces, and the provision of water and ablution was one of those things that have been done. In terms of the matriculate, that what has been happening is that they never closed. They never had a rotational attendance. They were attending on a daily basis. So was the grade 7 in terms of last year. So that because we knew that they are going to be writing external examination, they needed to be able to complete the syllabus so that they're able to write. And of course, the schools will continue to be closed, and they continued to be closed last year because you can't predict this particular pandemic. But what has happened, our teachers were always there with their management to ensure that the matriculants are done. But I must indicate to you, listeners, that the matric of this year are different from the last year, because you do work in grade 11, and we didn't do much in grade 11 last year. And then we have seen this year again that the teachers have taken the learners during this particular winter holidays and sacrificed their families and their time to make sure that they teach the learners. So other students were going on a rotational basis, but not the grade 12.
So you speak about having to adapt to these changes. I mean, we've also seen budget cuts. This has also directly impacted on the quality of education in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. So my question to you is, how have we also managed, as we get the ball rolling during these unprecedented times, to not only upskill and adapt for both teachers and learners going forward?
Well, thank you for that question. Really, it's a matter that when we were adapting and understanding that we're going to live with this particular virus for a long time, as a country, we were shocked, in particular as an organization, that instead of investing in education, education was required to part with about 2.7 billion in 2020. And it is required again to part with another 2.6 billion this year, which translate to other provinces like KZN to be almost like 4 billion, Gauteng to be almost like 6 billion. You cannot build an education system if you regard it as an expense and not regard it as an investment. It has an impact, clearly, in terms of additional personnel that we require at the level of the school to be able to help the teachers in terms of the teaching assistants, in terms of the general assistants that must be able to help the teachers, because the teachers have taken more heavy load during this time because they become social workers, they become therapists, they become, police. Therefore, you needed additional resources. And with this austerity budget, we believe that the country does not understand the importance of education. And as an organization, together with the other union, we are challenging these financial cuts, because these cuts are not meant to improve the quality of education and the lives of our people and building an inclusive, sustainable economy. Austerity measures by itself, they cause violence in a country, and we cannot afford to see that.
Well, speaking of violence, we've seen the impact that the recent looting and vandalism has also had in schools, teaching and learning at large. Have you been able to quantify what that looks like, and also where to from here for the learners affected?
Yes, we have quantified in terms of KZN that about 137 schools have been vandalized. In Gauteng, about 43 schools have been vandalized. This is not new, because in 2020, we have seen our schools being targeted by criminals who come and target the administration blocks, as well as where we store the nutrition of our learners, our children, who have got to go to the classroom having been fed, so that they're then able to take advantage of learning, so that they can change the lives of their own people and our country. That we have seen this vandalism. Honestly, we are shocked as an organization that a nation that attacks education attacks its future. That a nation that vandalizes and loot a school is looting the future of the children. And therefore, that nation is going to have it very difficult to succeed in terms of building a resilient economy, but also in terms of stability, because of the lawlessness of our society in South Africa, that you have got the law enforcement agencies, including the ministries, that are never called to account when a school is burned down. We never see people being brought to book. We never see justice. So people begin to believe that this is the way of life because they are never going to be punished. There are no consequences. And we want to hear the president really saying, when is the Minister of Safety and Security and the Minister of State Security, when are they going to be called to account? Why do we have schools to be banned? Why do you kill the future of our people?
And it definitely speaks to the systemic issues that need to also be addressed 27 years into our democracy. But perhaps to conclude this conversation today, Mr. Maluleke, let's look at the overall state of readiness, just given the losses of the academic year that have been incurred, the looting and vandalism that have impacted some of these schools. What are you hoping to hear after the president's speech tonight? In the same breath, what are your biggest concerns?
Thank you for the question. What we would want to hear from the president today, honestly, is not to see the president smiling or the president being sad about anything. The president must be able to attend to the issues that are super spreaders. Our schools are not super spreaders. They are super spreaders and they need to be addressed. That's what we want to hear from the president. Secondly, we want to hear the president really calling to those ministries to really account in terms of why there are no law enforcement agencies that are continuing to enforce what we regard as the Disaster Management Act. If they say there must be 100 people outside together when there are 110, who has got to take responsibility for that? In terms of the schools reopening, clearly it is that we have been with the department where they presented their plans, one in terms of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, in terms of the provision of sanitizers, water and soap for washing, and ablution systems. And clearly in terms of the vandalism of the schools, we have had the report from the department saying they are going to ask other churches and other institutions to afford those learners in KwaZulu-Natal to be able to use those particular institutions for education to be continuing and so forth. So what we would want to see, it is that indeed there is a support from the communities, that we all stand up, all of us, and support education, so that, because education is not a super spread, education is a barrier against the transmission because we follow protocols. But it is what we can do. It is in our hands. We cannot drop the ball. All of us have got to hold each other's hands and deal with violence and deal with everything that is really confronting our country. So we believe that the president has got to really, once and for all, really reshuffle the cabinet. If you have ministers who are not accountable, who are not doing anything, we are living in a crime, we cannot continue to be seeing the president really not doing anything. That's our expectation. We expect the president finally to really take decisions.
What happens if he does not address some of these concerns? What will your response as a union be?
Well, what we can expect if the president really is not going to take decision is that we're going to see crime being normalized. We're going to see more schools being vandalized, and that will be taken as a norm in the society. And therefore, we as an organization will have to be campaigning. We are working with all the communities in terms of our I Am a School campaign, where we are saying it is time that the civil society will stand up and help our government to making sure that people are accountable for what they have been entrusted with, and that is the lives of our people. And we need to do that. And we want to hear the president also making sure that our students who qualify to be vaccinated, they must be vaccinated, and vaccinate everybody in the country so that we are able to have our lives and be able to do what we can do. Otherwise, the academic year, we cannot be chasing it around. We have got to make sure that we adjust it from time to time, because the pandemic cannot be predicted. And therefore, we must not adopt the style by the Department of Education that says we want to save the academic year. No, you've got to go and ask these orthodoxies of testing and testing. What are the skills that we require in the 21st century? Are we able to afford that? Are we able to do that? Where are the laptops and the tablets for the learners, so that when the school is closed, we are able to have online education and distant education? Those ministers must be able to account, must be told what are they doing to ensure that our learners are provided with these particular gadgets, and our teachers.
All right, it seems there are more questions than answers at this point. Again, we are chatting to General Secretary of SATU, Mugwena Maluleke, chatting about the state of readiness for schools reopening ahead of the president's address today. Now, we continue with more news and updates on the other side. In fact, Kaya Sitole is going to be joining us for a chat about the Township economy in the wake of South Africa's unrest. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. This is a look at the week ahead with myself, Liezle Wilson. We continue with more news now, where the COVID-19 pandemic and recent unrest in South Africa has exposed the fragility of economies and vulnerability of poorer nations. This by highlighting the vast inequalities that exist therein. Now, as we know, the informal economy in South Africa is a viable and important form of employment and enabler of economic mobility. Our Township local economic development is a means of addressing the dire socio-economic conditions in South Africa, where Township economy revival is key. Our ABSIP Treasurer, Kaya Sitole, explores the roadmap ahead as we chat about the Township economy at large. Kaya, good afternoon and thank you for joining us. I think to contextualize the conversation, let's just look at the role of the informal economy relative to the South African economy at large.
Good afternoon and good afternoon to the viewers. So, of course, as a consequence of our history, South Africa does indeed operate at parallel economies. And one of the distinguishing features tends to be that there's one economy which is heavily formalized, which is probably what gets tracked quite well when you talk about economic indicators. But what we do know is that there's an equally robust economy happening away from the traditional parameters of how we tend to measure economic activity. So the term that is used to refer to that is the informal economy, where transactions may be happening beyond the scope of traditional financing structures, for example. And that economy is as equally important as a formalized one. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that that informal economy tends to be centered around townships, for example, and rural economies, which is where we've seen over the past couple of weeks a lot of destruction happening. So the questions around how do we actually track and assist where necessary are as equally important as any packages that we may be putting together for the more formal parts of the economy.
So forced to face the intentional and structural inequality in South Africa, let's start off by looking at the effect that the recent economic protests and looting have had on townships and the township economy.
Yeah, so obviously what we do know is that unfortunately townships did bear the brunt of the looting and the loss that you saw. And what we also know with particularly in relation to township businesses, they were already explaining the fragilities that they found or they discovered about themselves. Particularly we saw the pandemic hit us last year. So when the pandemic became a thing, we suddenly discovered that a lot of those particular businesses didn't have access to some of the social security nets that some of the more formal businesses had. So you had people that said, I've been employed, I've been working, we've been forced into lockdown, and now I've discovered that I'm unable to access UIF, for example, because it just turns out that my employer had not registered for that. So we already knew that there were those pre-existing fragilities. And what we're now seeing is that while those fragilities would have at least led to a business being locked down or shut down and still remaining viable, the looting and the destruction has actually then created this additional problem where the question of what it takes to restore and rebuild those businesses is equally important. And there's also a fear that there's an element, a widespread element of under-insurance within township businesses, where even though other people may, well, we've got insurance that's going to cover us for the looting, it then turns out that some businesses actually didn't have access to those insurance mechanisms, which means that their capacity to rebuild is severely limited.
So Kaya, in the same breath then, with the development of township economies, how do we go about protecting, rebuilding, restoring, revitalizing, and ultimately transforming in the aftermath of these events?
One of the key problems that has been highlighted is that people and their compliance status is not always a question of people not willing to comply, but perhaps a question of understanding what the compliance regime is and the cost of participating in the compliance regime are key points that have been raised. And what happens with township economies is that we find that many of these structures, where they're talking about the CIPC, for example, are not really visible within the township structure. So people may either have to rely on someone making them aware of what it is that you need to do in order to register business. You need someone to be able to educate you and take you through the process of all the formal hurdles and the loopholes that you have to meet in order to ensure that you're not found wanting at a time of crisis. So there's clearly a lot of assistance that these businesses need, and that obviously a lot of players in the ecosystem to acknowledge the fact that we cannot be evaluating these businesses from the prism of the structures and the rules that we've written for the more formal businesses. We need to be a bit more nuanced and a bit more agile in understanding what the operational ecosystem is like, and then putting products together that are responsive to the key issues that have been identified. And I think obviously over the past couple of weeks, and also in particular over the past year during the pandemic, we've seen a lot more of those issues coming to the fore. And in order to ensure that these businesses remain viable, assistance is required in multiple forms.
Yeah, so you speak about support mechanisms on offer. What is government's role in terms of all of this? I mean, in terms of urban planning, capital access, but even directing it to where it needs to go, where it'll have the greatest impact, and then also empowering women and the youth, and also incorporating diversity through social cohesion.
Yeah. Look, the primary role of any government is to lead the policy formulation exercise. And of course, what you need to be able to have is to ensure that the policy framework enables many more individuals to say, well, if I decide to take a gamble and enter the world of entrepreneurship, I at least understand how the various systems and how the laws and regulations interact and intersect in order for me to know what needs to be done. So the primary role of government has always been on the policy formulation. And why government must always take the lead role there is that obviously government has got the overarching responsibility for coordinating many parts of the ecosystem. You don't want people who then have a vested interest in one part of the ecosystem to be leading that charge, because they'll obviously prioritize their own interests. So that's the main thing. Government needs to be able to lead the policy formulation. What we also know about government is that it probably has access to a much deeper element of resources, whether it's financial resources or whether it's institutional resources that can be able to assist businesses learn and navigate their way through this. So we do know that, for example, a lot of businesses that are conceptualized as startup businesses never succeed. So if you then decide to set up that business in the township, what tends to happen is that the traditional financing mechanisms, whether it's the banks or any other institutions, would immediately brand you as high risk, which means that the cost of actually accessing financing to even start that business is much higher than it would be if you're in the suburb or in the CBD, for example. So those are challenges that are well known. And the question that has to be deliberated on is how do we then ensure that in spite of those historic limitations, because face it, a lot of them are indeed a creature of history, in spite of those limitations, how do we then create products that are conducive to the problem that you're trying to solve? Because us having to rely on the traditional ways of evaluating businesses and the traditional ways of supporting businesses has clearly not delivered the dividends that South Africa needs in order to catch up with the missing economic demographic and the missing economic dividend that is a consequence of how people were excluded from key parts of the economy for such extended periods of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're looking to understand the realities of both the residents and the traders within townships, I want to look at the role of leadership, the role of innovation, and even data acquisition, real granular data, which can be used for townships to identify potential and then leverage off of these. Is enough being done in that regard?
It's a great tragedy that in order to be able to even get a snapshot of the state of the township economy at any point in time, you're going to have to put together so many overlapping pieces of information, because from what we've seen, there isn't a singular reference point that can be able to track that within this particular township or within this particular rural community. Here are so many businesses that have been registered through channels. Here are so many other businesses that we're aware of, but we know that they haven't been registered through the formal channels. So because the data doesn't exist, it becomes even more difficult to even know what it is that is required to be rolled out as immediate interventions. So even over the past couple of weeks when we've been looking at the looting, I don't know if there's been a single source or a single database that has then tried to track who has been affected, who has an insurance problem, who needs assistance with capital to reopen, and who needs assistance with capital just to repair their shops. So that inability to put the information together has become the great limitation. And what we were hoping is that you'd have the type of leadership that would say, either at the small business ministry, for example, that we are championing the cause of not just of emerging businesses across the ecosystem, but because of the particular and the unique issues relating to township businesses, we are putting together a structure or a system where we can at least be able to know who's there, who exists. And unfortunately, as it stands right now, if you and I are driving on the street, we may be able to identify, but if you then ask which part of the government or the formal ecosystems knows who you are as an entrepreneur, acknowledges what you do, you find that the answers are quite simply not there.
Kaya, we're going to have to wrap up the conversation. I think I can't leave you without looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and perhaps its broader impact on informal markets and cross-border trading. What risks and benefits are also available as we explore these terrains?
I think the primary risk, as it is with everything that we do in South Africa, and I suppose originally, is the fact that there might be a gap between the implementation, between the conceptualization and the implementation. So there's clearly out that there are significant benefits are associated with opening up the routes of trade across the region and across the continent at large. We do know that the abolition of tariffs, for example, which is a key conduit of how that trade agreement aims to actually facilitate our trade across the continent, is an important part. However, it would be pointless for us to say we abolish tariffs if we then aren't dealing with the granular issues that enable people to benefit from a tariff-free regime, for example. So if we still cannot explain what it costs and how we can get goods moved from the harbour in Durban all the way to Musina, all the way to Gaborone, for example, in the most cost-effective way, that enables even the players that do not have the benefit of large scale, which is the small entrepreneurs and even the township and the rural entrepreneurs, to be able to benefit that without being charged these excessive fees of participation, then we aren't actually solving for the bigger problem. So all we may have as a reflection point is that we managed to abolish tariffs, but people still couldn't participate. So it's remarkably critical for African leaders to be able to then say the tariff abolition was simply the first part. We need to be able to answer the question that if an entrepreneur says, I hear that you guys are now saying I'm able to export my goods to Angola or to Botswana, please explain to me how I can do it, who do I talk to, and how do I make things done? Until you're able to answer those questions, you're going to see that the entrenched, big, large entities that have the benefit of scale and even the benefit of using their own resources will be the only ones that this trade agreement has been beneficial.
Kaya, we wait with bated breath to see how we are going to take it from implementation into fruition. Again, with the spotlight on township economies in the wake of economic protests and looting exacerbated by current COVID-19 pandemic, much is needed to drive social cohesion and create long-term sustainable investments. Again, ABSIP Treasurer Kaya Sithole joining us for that discussion. Our President Cyril Ramaphosa will address the nation this evening on developments in the country's response to COVID-19 pandemic. There's mounting pressure on government to ease the current level 4 restrictions as the number of coronavirus infections in the third wave appears to be declining. The President's address will be preceded by the meeting of the National Coronavirus Command Council, where the NCCC will discuss the country's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And although almost 70,000 people have succumbed to the virus, the country is slowly but surely on track to roll out its vaccination program. So far, 6 million South Africans have been vaccinated, and the number is likely to increase as the country returns to normalcy after the unrest of 2 weeks ago. Well, that is it. It's where we leave the show for you today. It's been an absolute pleasure once again from myself, Liezle Wilson, and the rest of the team. Until next time, it is goodbye for now.